This is going to be a rather short topic, just covering the anatomy of the heart. After that, we'll get into the physiology of the heart, we'll talk about the cardiac cycle, and we'll talk about the pathways that blood takes throughout the body. Despite what a lot of people might think when they're pledging allegiance to something or someone and putting their hand on their chest, the heart is not located entirely on the left-hand side of the body. It does lie in the midline, so the mid-sternal line or mid-sagittal plane, but it hangs over to the left. So about 2/3 of the heart is left of the midline. Notably, the apex of the heart, the point at the bottom of the heart, is to the left. And that bit flicks quite a bit when the heart beats, and it generates most of the vibration or pulse that you can feel in your own chest. The heart lies in a region of the chest known as the mediastinum. This is the region between the right and left lungs, so between those pleural cavities. It contains the heart and the pericardial sac that surrounds the heart. It contains a number of blood vessels, the esophagus, trachea, nerves, the thymus gland that lies on top of the heart, a lot of lymph nodes, some connective tissue. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. In this diagram here, you're seeing a cross section or transverse section through the chest. We're looking down on that to see the heart and lungs. The mediastinum would be the region here. And I'll try to outline this as smoothly as I can. It also is going to include everything back to the spinal column. So it's going to include the esophagus and those blood vessels. That region there is defined as the mediastinum. Now we're seeing an anterior view of the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is bound on the left and the right by the pleural cavities. It's bound on the bottom by the diaphragm. But there really isn't anything obvious that binds the top. It's roughly that region. If you look in a lot of textbooks and online sources, you'll hear the mediastinum described as a cavity. And there is kind of a cavity between the two lungs. However, there is no clear delineation, there's no membrane that wraps around this entire region. The top here, as you can see, is open, and we just have connective tissue at the top. Connective tissue fills much of that area that includes the blood vessels. So I would say calling it a cavity isn't quite right. I think it's more proper to refer to it as a region. The heart moves around a lot and changes shape quite a bit as it pumps. In order for it not to simply stick to the inside of the chest wall, it's within a double-walled sac. At the bottom of this diagram here, you've got a nice analogy to show how this works. So imagine taking your fist, and your fist is about the size of your heart, and pushing it into a poorly inflated balloon. The balloon would wrap around your fist and create this double-walled pouch. Now, the one thing to note is that the pericardium contains a very thin pericardial cavity. That cavity is going to expand and contract with the heart, and there's not a whole lot of fluid in there. So there's just going to be a film of serous fluid. The wall of the heart is quite thick, and it's made up mostly of muscle. That layer is known as the myocardium. On the inside of the myocardium, so the part of the wall that's in contact with the chambers of the heart, we have a layer of endothelium known as endocardium, endo meaning inside. On the outside of that muscle layer, we have a layer of serous pericardium. Remember when we talked about the organs of the digestive system, we talked about how this serous layer on the outside of an organ, like the stomach or the intestine, is known as the visceral layer. That's the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. This visceral layer is going to fold back on itself to create a second layer, which is the parietal layer. The parietal layer and the visceral layer of the serous pericardium are going to produce serous fluid that's going to make those surfaces very, very slippery. The other thing to note is that this sac is attached to the large blood vessels at the top of the heart, and it's also attached to the diaphragm at the bottom. Here we have a section of the wall of the heart and also the pericardium. The endocardium is on the inside of the heart, it's in contact with the blood. Then we have this thick layer of muscle known as the myocardium, then the visceral pericardium, then a space filled with serous fluid. Again, it's a pretty narrow space, and then our parietal pericardium. In this diagram, the black represents the pericardial cavity. The red on either side of that cavity is the serous pericardium. So again, we have a visceral layer that's in direct contact with the wall of the heart, so it is stuck to the myocardium. And then we have that outer parietal layer. Now notice outside of the parietal layer itself, we have what's called a fibrous pericardium. This is made of connective tissue, and this makes the pericardial sac a very tough structure. In green in this diagram is the mediastinum. The muscle of the heart not only is responsible for the pumping of the heart, it also serves a structural function. So what you're seeing here is bundles of cardiac muscle that are wrapping around the walls of the heart where we have valves attached. We don't want those regions to collapse or the valves can't work. There's also a lot of fibrous connective tissue in these regions. And that's what you're seeing on the right. You're seeing a map of the fibrous skeleton that helps support these walls, stiffen the walls so that the valves they hold don't collapse on themselves. This is a section through the heart, specifically through a plane that intersects with the 4 valves of the heart. What you're seeing in blue is the fibrous skeleton. The skeleton is made out of collagen and elastic fibers, and as mentioned, it's going to help support and toughen the wall around the valves so that the valves have a firm point of attachment. It's also going to serve as attachment for the myocardium, the layer of muscle, and it acts as an electrical insulator. And we'll talk more about what that means when we get into the physiology aspect of the heart. But basically, we want to delay the signal that travels between the atria and the ventricles. The ghost heart that you're seeing here is the result of a rather interesting lab procedure. What you can do is you can take a heart, and this is a human heart, dip it into a bath of enzymes that will break down most of the proteins that make up the tissue. They leave behind the elastin or elastic fibers and the collagen. So you're seeing the framework of the heart. You're seeing the extracellular matrix of the heart. At the top, that very large blood vessel is the aorta. And notice that it contains a lot of fibers. In fact, more than half of the mass of the aorta is made up of elastic fibers and collagen. So we have this very flexible but still very tough skeleton to the heart. And this skeleton is going to resist stretch. Okay, so let's dive into the anatomy of the heart. And we're going to start with the superficial anatomy, looking at the surface structures. So first of all, just be aware that when you're talking about the heart, and you're talking about whether something is on the right side or the left side, we're talking about the patient's right and left, or the specimen's right and left. We're not talking about your right and left. So a structure that's on the right side of this diagram is actually on the left-hand side of the heart because we're looking at this from the front. This is an anterior view. So keep that in mind. The heart has 4 chambers. It's got 2 thin-walled atria that receive blood, and then it's got 2 thicker-walled ventricles that pump blood away from the heart. Arteries are going to be carrying blood away from the heart. Veins are carrying blood towards the heart. Now, typically, veins are going to contain deoxygenated blood, but that's not always the case, as we'll see. Arteries usually contain oxygenated blood, but again, that's not always the case, as we'll see. Now, unfortunately, different textbooks have different ways of representing this. Sometimes veins are shown always as blue and arteries are shown always as red, but in other cases, like the diagrams I have here and the diagrams you have in your textbook, red represents oxygenated blood and blue represents deoxygenated blood. Now remember, of course, that the blood is never blue. We talked about that before. It's bright red, so scarlet, or dark red. It's never anything other than red. Okay, so looking at the surface of the heart here, you can see that we have blood vessels on the surface as well. We have a left and right coronary artery in this view. And the left coronary artery actually travels along a sulcus, a deep depression. And this depression is known as the interventricular sulcus. It actually separates the two ventricles. So looking at the surface of the heart, you find the location of that left coronary artery, follow it down, and then that's the division between the two ventricles. Let's look at the blood vessels that connect to the heart. We have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and they're carrying blood from the upper part of the body and the lower part of the body, respectively, into the right atrium. The right atrium is going to pass blood into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will contract and push blood out through the pulmonary trunk and into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Again, they're shown in blue because they're containing deoxygenated blood. The blood hasn't had a chance to get back to the lungs and be oxygenated. We have blood returning from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, and that's going to come into the left atrium and then passed on to the left ventricle, and then that oxygenated blood is pushed out through the aorta. So we have the ascending aorta. Because it ascends, it goes upwards, and then it curves, forming the aortic arch, and then descends down behind the heart, not shown here, in the descending aorta. And we have major blood vessels that come off at the top of that arch that feed the upper part of the body. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about general circulation. Now let's take a look at the back of the heart. So we have, again, the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava in blue on the right-hand side of the diagram. We have the aortic arch in red at the top. Underneath that, we have the pulmonary trunk branching off into the left and right pulmonary artery. Underneath that, we have the pulmonary veins, and they're shown in red because they contain oxygenated blood. They contain blood that's coming back from the lungs. Remember, the definition of a vein doesn't have anything to do with the oxygenation of the blood. It just has to do with the fact that we have a vessel that's coming towards the heart. It's carrying blood towards the heart. On the back, we have more superficial blood vessels that are going to feed the outer layers of the myocardium. Now let's take a look inside the heart. So we're seeing here a frontal section through the heart, and we're looking at this from an anterior viewpoint. Again, we have 4 chambers. We have 2 ventricles and we have 2 atria. The ventricles have much thicker walls, and the reason for that is they have to push blood quite a bit further, so they need a thicker myocardial layer. The atria are simply receiving blood and pushing that the short distance into the corresponding ventricles. The left ventricle is much thicker walled than the right ventricle, and that's because the left ventricle is going to push blood out to most of the body, whereas the right ventricle is only pushing blood out to the lungs, and the lungs are fairly close by. We also have 4 valves within the heart. We have a valve between the atria and the ventricles on both sides. So the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle is known as the right atrioventricular valve. That makes sense. It's also known as the tricuspid valve, and that's because it's got three cusps, three parts that come together to form a seal. So the function of a valve, of course, is to prevent blood from going in the wrong direction. Next, we have the pulmonary valve, and the pulmonary valve is at the base of the pulmonary trunk. It's in between the pulmonary trunk and the right ventricle. This can also be referred to as a semilunar valve. There's three parts to this. You can't see all three. You can only see two. You can see two cusps. The other cusp would be on the part of the pulmonary trunk that's being removed. But each one of these cusps has kind of a semi or crescent moon shape to it. On the left side, we have a valve between the left ventricle and the right atrium. That is known as the left atrioventricular valve, although it's also referred to as the bicuspid valve, and that's because it's made up of only two parts that come together to form a seal. It's also referred to as the mitral valve, but we'll come back to that in a bit. Finally, we have one more valve that's not too obvious on this diagram, so maybe I'll highlight it for you. It's right here. And that valve is known as the aortic valve. It prevents the backflow of blood that's leaving the left ventricle and going up behind the pulmonary trunk here and into the aorta. That valve is also referred to as a semilunar valve. So we have two semilunar valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. This diagram does a nice job of showing you the difference between the left ventricle and the right ventricle. The left ventricle contains walls that are much, much thicker, so we have a thicker myocardium, we have more muscle, and also that wall forms a complete ring around the cavity. If you compare that to the right ventricle, the myocardium is much thinner, and also the wall doesn't completely surround the cavity. Instead, it kind of gloms on or sticks onto the side of the left ventricle. We have a wall that divides the two ventricles. It separates them into two separate cavities, and that's known as the interventricular septum. Septum means wall, inter means between. So again, pay attention to where the names come from. They do actually make sense. And this interventricular septum would be this region in here. But note that it's part of the left ventricle myocardium. We'll very quickly take a look at the circulation of blood within the body, but we'll come back to this in more detail in the next topic. Remember that as mammals, we have two circuits. We have a pulmonary circuit and we have a systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit involves the lungs. This is where blood is going to get rid of carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. The systemic circuit involves the body tissues. And what's going on here is the opposite. This is where the blood is going to lose oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. The heart is divided into two separate halves. We have a right and left ventricle, and they're divided by the interventricular septum. The atria, left and right, are also isolated from each other. And that means that the right side of the heart will only deal with deoxygenated blood, while the left side of the heart will only deal with oxygenated blood. This prevents any mixing in the adult, not in the fetus, as we may talk about later. It's a fascinating topic. But in the adult, the blood flows are totally separated, and this makes the whole system more efficient. Let's look at this in a bit more detail. And I have to say, I really quite like this diagram. It's a really good overview of blood flow through the body. The kind of thing you might want to look over for, I don't know, an exam or something like that. Let's start at number 1, So that seems like a good place to start. The right ventricle contains deoxygenated blood. The right ventricle is going to contract and force that blood up into the pulmonary trunk, which is number 2. Now notice it's going to pass through the pulmonary valve as that occurs, and that will stop blood, hopefully, from flowing backwards. It'll only be able to go forwards. Next, that blood is going to diverge into the right and left pulmonary arteries and get to the right and left lungs. So number 3, the blood is going to be oxygenated. It's going to lose carbon dioxide, it's going to gain oxygen. The blood is going to come back through the pulmonary veins to number 4, which is the left atrium of the heart. The left atrium of the heart is going to contract and push blood into the left ventricle, number 5. And it's passing blood through the left atrioventricular valve. Blood is then going to be pushed by the left ventricle through the aortic valve and out into the aorta, which would be number 6. Blood is going to diverge to the upper part of the body through the brachiocephalic trunk and the common carotid artery, etc. We'll get to that later. And also go down to the lower extremities of the body through the descending aorta. So now we have our systemic loop. That would be number 7 and number 8, where we're going to lose oxygen to tissues and pick up carbon dioxide and other waste products. Blood will come back through the posterior or inferior vena cava, 2 names for the same thing, and also through the anterior or superior vena cava, back into the right atrium, which is number 11. And then the blood is going to be pushed by the contraction of the right atrium into the ventricle. And to do that, of course, the blood has to pass through the right atrioventricular valve. And then this whole process starts over. And one thing to note that's rather important is that the 2 halves of the heart are contracting together. So they're beating in unison. Ventricles have very thick walls that are made up mainly of myocardium. And the muscle that makes up myocardium is very energetic. It requires lots of oxygen, lots of nutrients, lots of ions, etc. Blood flow within the chambers of the heart isn't sufficient to feed the outer layers of myocardium. Instead, they need their own dedicated blood flow, and that comes from superficial arteries on the surface of the heart. If we look at the anterior of the heart, we have the left and right coronary arteries, which are quite obvious, that come directly off of the aorta. They're the first branches of the aorta. Another thing that's interesting about these arteries is that they connect with each other through anastomoses. You can see a couple examples here. We have one here and we have one down here. So an anastomosis is where 2 capillary beds connect together, and they're directly connected and they can share blood flow. So let's imagine a scenario where maybe we have a blockage within a branch of the right coronary artery. So let's say that we have a blockage here. So we have a thrombosis that has come loose and formed an embolus, and then settled down here to form an embolism and blocked blood flow through that fine channel. Now, because blood is blocked, blood from the right coronary artery isn't going to get into the middle of the heart, the region between those 2 coronary arteries. However, blood can still flow from branches of the left coronary artery down through that anastomosis and into that blocked area. And hopefully that region will survive. It will receive enough oxygen and nutrients. Now, of course, that's not always the case. We can have a severe blockage or multiple blockages that cause an area on the surface of the heart to not receive enough oxygen and potentially die, worst case scenario, or at least not function, not contract as it should, and that is a heart attack. If we have a permanently damaged blood vessel, permanently blocked, that can be removed, and that piece of vessel that's cut out can be replaced with some healthy blood vessel that's being scavenged from another part of the body, and that's known as a bypass. So we have two arteries, the left and right coronary artery, that supply blood flow to the ventricular wall. Remember that the aorta contains oxygenated blood that's under quite a lot of pressure. The coronary arteries are going to branch many times, and they're going to supply blood to the majority of the ventricular surface. On the right, you're seeing a cast of an individual's heart. So this is, once again, a rather interesting laboratory procedure. They've taken a human heart and they've injected red-colored latex, sort of a rubbery substance, into the coronary arteries. And this latex has flown into all of the branches of the coronary arteries. After that, they've taken the heart and they've digested away the soft tissue with enzymes, and we're left with this cast of the coronary arterial system. Now, if you're paying attention, the one thing you'll realize right away is that this individual apparently had 3 coronary arteries. And that's a bit weird, but it's not that weird. So let's take a look at the diagram again. You'll notice that we have our left coronary artery, and then we have a rather significant branching point right here, where that coronary artery branches off into 2 arteries. Now, all that's happened in this individual is that branching point didn't occur there. Instead, it occurred at the aorta. So basically, we've got a right coronary artery, and that would be over here. And then we've got 2 left coronary arteries. And I only point this out because it's important to note that most people have a few rather significant abnormalities within their bodies, and they're not necessarily something to worry about. When the circulatory system is developing, you can see that the branches look a lot like rootlets or branches on a tree, and development occurs that way to some extent. There is a bit of variability. So all people are going to have the same major branches of veins and arteries, but everyone will have some minor differences. Now, this is a fairly significant difference, but it's not one that causes a problem. All the blood is still getting where it needs to go. Now, if you were to see something like this as a doctor or a nurse on an MRI, for instance, it might take you a moment to realize what's going on, but it's important to note that it's not necessarily problematic. Of course, once that blood from the coronary arteries has been used by the ventricular tissues, it needs to be recollected. That deoxygenated blood is going to be recollected by cardiac veins. It's going to be passed onto a coronary sinus on the posterior of the heart. A sinus is a swelling in a vein or a chamber or cavity that collects venous blood. The blood is going to be passed from the coronary sinus onto the right atrium. And remember that the right atrium contains deoxygenated blood. Here we have a section of the heart where the section passes through all the valves of the heart. And this isn't a nice, neat transverse section. It's an oblique section. It's a section at kind of a crazy angle. But you can see that we have the 2 atrioventricular valves. So that would be the tricuspid on the left of the diagram, which of course is the right of the heart. So the tricuspid, remember, is the right atrioventricular valve. And then next to that, we have the left atrioventricular valve, which is known as the bicuspid because there's 2 parts, also known as the mitral valve. In front of those 2 valves, we have the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve, and both of those are referred to as semilunar valves. They have 3 kind of wedge-shaped bits, cusps, that snap together to form a seal. And here you're seeing an actual image of one of these semilunar valves. This is the aortic valve. We're seeing it from a superior view. We're looking down. If blood were to be pumped out of the heart, it would be coming towards us. Now, as you can appreciate, if blood were to fall back down towards the heart, it would fill up the cusps that make up this valve. The cusps are shaped like cups. They would trap blood and they would cause the surfaces of each cusp to be pushed together and form a seal. That's how these valves work. Let's quickly review the flow of blood through the heart. So we're going to have deoxygenated blood traveling from the lower extremities of the body up through the inferior vena cava and into the right atrium. We're going to have blood coming from the upper body through the superior vena cava into the right atrium. Then that blood is going to be pushed by the right atrium through the right atrioventricular valve and into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to contract and it's going to push the blood up through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary trunk. From there, the blood is going to diverge into the left pulmonary artery, which will go to the left lung, and also through the right pulmonary artery and into the right lung. Okay, that's the right side of the heart. Now let's look at the left side of the heart. So we have blood that comes in through the pulmonary veins. So that would be here, 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 and here. So we have the right and left pulmonary veins, and they're also divided into superior and inferior. The blood is going to flow into the left atrium. And it's not really shown here, but of course we'd have blood coming from the back as well, from the right pulmonary veins. And then that blood is going to be pushed by the left atrium through the left atrioventricular valve and into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, and then blood is going to be pushed up through the aortic valve and then through the aortic arch. It's going to go around the aortic arch and then down the descending aorta and down to the lower extremities, and it's also going to go through blood vessels up to the head and chest and upper limbs. Finally, if you're wondering why the left atrioventricular valve, or bicuspid valve, is also known as the mitral valve, it's because the Pope wears a funny hat. A funny hat named a mitre, and his funny hat looks a lot like the bicuspid valve. And finally, here's our terminology.